Today I'm going to give a share on a very mystical person and a mystical situation, really. One of the most difficult parshas in the Torah and Tanakh is the story of Shimshon, Hagibor, Samson, in English, Samson, Shimshon. And we're going to try and understand what it is that Shimshon did and so on. There seems to be a lot of contradictions and problems with this whole parsha. And it sounds, basically that there's a certain depth to this parsha which is completely hidden and concealed. And it's going to be something that we're going to try and analyze and try and find out the real meaning of what Shimshon was, what he was supposed to do, and what happened. And I believe it's going to completely revise our understanding of Shimshon Hagibor, because it seems to be that Shimshon Hagibor was in conflict with the Philistines, the Philistines, who are called the Philistines, and did certain things and so on. But it turns out that upon the really analysis, that the story of Shimshon is not a national story. It's an international story of tremendous significance. And we're going to try and comprehend exactly what this is. So first of all, I want to ask certain questions about Shimshon, who was Samson, so that we all understand that Shimshon Hagibor is Samson, the mighty one. So first of all, Shimshon Hagibor was an extraordinarily strong man. The story of Shimshon is that an angel appeared to his parents, one after the other, father and mother, and told them that they would have a son who would be very unusual. And they were to make him a Nazirite, a Nazir from birth. What is a Nazir? A Nazir is a person who accepts a certain mode of behavior which has a certain holiness to it. The person who's a Nazir cannot cut his hair, he cannot drink wine, and he cannot get tameh by going to a grave. So in certain way, the practices of a Nazir qualifies them for a higher level of kedusha than normally. Normally, a period of Naziris only lasts about a month or 30 days or so, or a little more. But Shimshon was supposed to be, from birth, he was supposed to accept the oath of being a Nazir, and he would be a Nazir for the rest of his life. So this is what the angel told the parents, and they did so. They made him a Nazir, and they conducted his life because he was a Nazir. It turns out that who was Shimshon? Well, first of all, Shimshon lived at the time of the Judges, which was a period of time right after Yetzias Mitzrayim. The Jews went out of Egypt because of the plagues of Egypt, and they went to the Yam Suf, and they passed the Yam Suf, and they destroyed the whole Egyptian army. And that's the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. But then they did certain sins, namely the two major sins that they did while they were in the desert. And this was the sin of the golden calf, which they worshipped, while Moshe Rabbeinu was trying to bring down the Torah from heaven to earth. So because of this sin, they lost the ability for that Torah to reflect the 50th gate, which is the highest level of Torah knowledge, which allows you to really understand almost anything about the world and what God is doing. They lost that source, and they received the second Torah on Yom Kippur. And this is the Torah that we possess now. So we possess the second tablets. In addition to this, there was also the sin of the spies. And the sin of the spies, where these spies went out to the land of Israel while the Jews were in the desert at that time. And what they did was they came back with a report that fundamentally was somewhat true, but they exaggerated certain instances, and they gave certain interpretations that there was no way that the way they saw that what the Meraglim, the spies said, that the Jews could not conquer the land of Israel. So all the Jews believed it, and they all wept. They all were sorry that they left Egypt, and they all had the charata that they left Egypt, and so on. So because they spoke, and they said that God is deceiving them, that He's going to give them the land of Israel, and that's an impossibility. And I'm going to explain this whole Maisa of the Meraglim at another point. But it was a major sin, and because of the sin of the spies that the Jews believed in the desert, they decided. So therefore, God said, these spies have spoken in a deceitful manner, and because you all believed what the spies are saying, and what you're doing is you're mourning the fact that you're in the desert, and I have brought you to a very bad place. So because of that, that day was Tisha B'Av, the day where the Jews listened to the spies and were very much saddened and depressed because of the report of the spies, was Tisha B'Av. So God said, this day will become a day of mourning for all of Klal Yisrael. And of course, we know that Tisha B'Av is the day that the first and second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. But in any case, the Jews then were condemned, and God forced them to stay in the desert for another 40 years. In other words, because of the sin of the spies, they lost the source or the merit of going into the land of Israel. And fundamentally, the whole generation who believed in the spies, what they said, they all died while they were in the desert. Every year, a certain number of them died. And this was exactly what the Bereshim did. But what happened was, after that, they went into Israel under Joshua, under Yoshua ben Nun, who was the student of Moshe Rabbeinu. And he conquered a large part of the land of Israel. And from then on, they were ruled by judges. These were people who were the heads of the Sanhedrin. And these were the greatest of all the scholars of the Jews. And therefore, the structure of the government of the Jews, they had no king, and they really didn't have a president or anything like that. But the rulers of Israel were really rabbis who were great, great scholars. And the chief scholar was the Av Bezin of the Sanhedrin, and he was the chief judge. So for 200 years or so, they were really ruled by these judges. And this was the government. If a person had an issue, he would bring another Jew. If he had an issue with a certain Jew, he would bring that Jew to a Bezdin, and they would decide the case. But fundamentally, this was the situation, that they were ruled by judges, one after the other. There was many judges. Devorah was a judge, and Gideon, and so on, and other ones. I'm not going to go into that. But anyway, the last judge that ruled Israel, he was the head of the Sanhedrin, and he was the Gadol Hador. He was the greatest in the world at that time, and his name was Shimshon. Samson. His name is Samson. And he was actually the head of the Sanhedrin. But he was a very unusual person. First of all, as I said, when he was born, his parents made him a Nazir. They took the Nazirite vow, and they made a Nazir from the time that he was born till the time that he died. But what was very unusual about him, he was the Gadol Hador, and he was the judge of Israel. And Shimshon was from the tribe of Dan. He was a Danite, and so on. And at his time, the Jews were sinning in certain ways, because I think one of the main sins is that they refused to really complete the conquest of the land of Israel. And they allowed some of the nations to live in Israel, who God said to them they should not allow these nations to live, like the Canaanites, the Perizim, the Yevusim, the Jebusites. These were 7 nations that lived in the land of Israel at that time, and they all worshipped idols. They all Baalei Avodah Zarah, and they all worshipped idols. And one of the major sins of the Jews is they somehow did not, they refused, or they did not take them out. They did not destroy these nations because they were idol worshippers. God wanted them to take out these idol worshippers from the nation so that the Jews would have a free position in the land of Israel and not be influenced by them. But somehow they were reticent to really do their job. Joshua took out most of the nations, but they allowed certain nations to exist. So what God did was he punished the Jews. They were punished, and therefore, and at certain periods of time, a certain phenomena occurred. The phenomena of what's called an internal gullus. Normally, gullus means exile. And when the Jews go into gullus, they have to leave the land of Israel and go into the gullus. So there were certain exiles that the Jews went into where they all left the land of Israel. Examples of the gullus of the Jews, which was an external gullus, because the Jews all were thrown out of the land of Israel, was the Babylonian exile, which destroyed the first place on the dish. And then there were also other exiles. There was exiles of the Persians. When the Persians vanquished the Babylonians and they took over the domination of Israel, most of the Jews lived in Persia, which is in current present-day Iran. So these two exiles, the Babylonian exile and the Persian exile, were external exiles. Finally, also, they had some, to an extent, they were in exile in terms of the Greece, the Yevonim, and also Rome was the biggest exile. And from the exile of the Jews in Rome, this lasted 2,000 years. That we are still in the exile, the external exile, but most of the Jews in the world are under the exile of the present-day Romans, who is called the Christians. Rome became Christian under Constantine, and it became a Christian nation. And then that nation further exiled the Jews, and the Jews went to the Middle East, and they went into Babylonia. They went to certain countries in the Middle East. And as they left Israel, they also went then finally to Spain, and then from Spain they went to Europe, Eastern Europe, first Western Europe, and then Eastern Europe. And then finally they went to Russia, and the last exile of the Jews is now currently in America. And the Jews have returned from America. A lot of Jews have gone back to the land of Israel. So the beginning of the redemption is somewhat occurring, is that the Jews have populated Israel, the land of Israel, and eventually all the Jews will go back to Israel when the Mashiach comes. So the story of the Jews for the last 2,000 years is called an external exile, where most of the Jews are exiled from the land of Israel, and they live in a foreign nation. But at that time, in the era of the judges, when Israel was governed by the judges of the Sanhedrin, they experienced what's called an internal exile, a Golus Panemius. That means that what the exile of the Jews in the land of Israel was done to a Goyish nation who lived in the land of Israel with them. So at the time of Shimshon, who was a judge of Israel from the tribe of Dan, but they were being persecuted by a nation called the Philistines, the Philistines. This was the Philistines, the Philistines. And they fundamentally dominated Israel. They had several wars with Israel, and they fundamentally won some of those wars, and they dominated the Jews who lived in the land of Israel. So this is called the Golus of Philistine, but it was an internal Golus, because the Jews did not leave the land of Israel as they were in exile, but they were in exile in the land of Israel itself. How? Because the Philistines actually dominated Israel and subjected them to a certain persecutions. So that's when Shimshon lived. Shimshon was one of the last of the judges, you see, before the Israelites chose a king, Saul. But before the Israelites chose Saul as the king, they were fundamentally governed by the judges for several hundred years. And the last of these judges was Shimshon, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, and at that time they were under the domination of the Philistines, who in a certain sense persecuted the Jews. Now where did the Philistines live? They lived in the land of the Philistines, which was in the southwest of Israel. In the city today, they lived in 5 cities, and the city, 2 of these cities is Ashdod and Ashkelon and Gaza. They lived in Gaza, and they lived in that whole area of Israel, in the west of Israel, in the southwest. But in that position, the Philistines dominated Israel, and they persecuted them. So that was the era when the judge Shimshon was there. Now, the story of Shimshon is a very unusual story. First of all, Shimshon was very different than any other leader of the Jewish people. There never has been, or there never will be, such a leader like Shimshon. What was unique about Shimshon? Shimshon was very strong. He was a Superman. He alone was able to combat the Philistines, and he killed thousands of them in the war. They captured Shimshon, and they wanted to make him a slave. But Shimshon, Hagibor, he's called the mighty, was so strong that he took the jawbone. He took a bone, the jawbone of a mule, and with that jawbone, he was able to kill several thousand Philistines single-handedly. So Shimshon Hagibor had the strength of a Superman. He did many other acts of strength. He picked up the gates to the city of Gaza and was able to pick up the whole gate that was attached to the city. He was that strong. And so on. He was invincible. So the question is, why did God make Shimshon so strong? He never made someone as strong as Shimshon. Nobody. He never made a person as strong as Shimshon, who was literally a Superman. So the first question is, why did God make Shimshon so spectacularly strong? You know, this is the first question that we ask. What was the thing? Now, one of the things that it says in the Tanakh, it says in the story of Shimshon, is that what Shimshon was trying to do, fundamentally, the story of Shimshon is related to in the Tanakh. And what it says there, that Shimshon was trying to find, because they persecuted the Jews in Israel, he was trying to find personal reasons where he would be angry at the Philistines. And through his anger, he would then punish them by, in certain ways, confronting them militarily. So the Tanakh says that Shimshon looked for excuses to punish the Philistines, to punish the Philistines with a confrontation. So what happened was Shimshon, in order to create different arguments with the Philistines so that he can kill many of them and punish them, he would look to get into a personal situation where he confronted them. So what Shimshon did was he actually moved. In other words, Shimshon actually lived among the Philistines. That's right, even though he's a Danite and he was a judge of Israel, but where did Shimshon live? He lived with the Philistines, who was a Goyish nation. And the reason why he lived with them, and he even married a Philistine woman, and so on. And the reason for this, and so on and so forth, is so that he could find a reason to take vengeance on them and punish them militarily. So in order to find a reason to punish them, he went down and he lived with them, and he even married a Philistine woman. And there's a controversy if that woman that he married was remained a goy, because the Philistines were goyim, or she became, or she converted. There's a machlokes on that. But in any case, he married a Philistine woman, and he encountered a woman who, Delilah, who he became friendly with, and so on and so forth. And he would punish the Philistines militarily. He killed many of them militarily. But it says, why was Shimshon so strong? So the reason is given because what God wanted to do with Shimshon is different than God ever did. God wanted to punish the Philistines personally. He did not want to, since the Philistines dominated the Jews in Israel, he did not want to literally punish the Philistines so that he would destroy them like he did the Egyptians in their domination of the Jews. But he wanted the Philistines to be punished because of what they were doing to the Jews. But God did not want to free the Jews from the Philistines. He allowed the persecution because God was punishing the Jews also. But he wanted the Philistines to feel this punishment because of what they were doing. So what he did was he made Samson into a superhuman, into a superman, so that Samson would punish the Philistines individually himself. And the only way he could do this without them blaming the Jews, without declaring total war on the Jews, is that Samson would punish the Philistines by finding a personal reason why the Philistines deserved to be punished. They did certain things against Samson continuously, and with each instance that they did, Samson, Shimshon, Hagibor punished them by killing many of them and destroying their property and so on and so forth. So the Philistines wanted Samson to punish the Philistines alone, without the Philistines blaming the Jews, so that they should not declare war on the Jews. So he wanted Shimshon Hagibor to punish the Philistines from personal reasons. So in order for Shimshon to do this, Shimshon had to be a superhuman. He had to be a strong, like Superman. You see it. So you see this from the story of Shimshon in the Tanakh. You see this, that Shimshon was constantly looking for reasons to punish the Philistines. But the question is, this doesn't make sense in actuality. You never saw this. In other words, when God wanted to punish the Jews and he brought a nation which in some way persecuted the Jews, and this was an internal exile of the Jews in the land of Israel because they were dominated by the Philistines. But when God wanted to redeem them, he would destroy the Philistines. So God either wanted the Jews punished or he wanted them what? Freed. So these were the two options that God always used. Either he destroyed the persecuting nation that persecuted the Jews and redeemed them from this persecution, or God would continue to punish them by having a Goyish nation dominate the Jews. But what we never saw in all of history, where God wanted the Philistines to continue to dominate the Jews. But yet at the same time, he wanted the Philistines to be punished also. So he made Shimshon a superman so that he alone could punish the Philistines without them being able to blame the Jews as a totality. So therefore, he commanded Shimshon Hagibor, who was a Novi, he commanded him to go down to the land of the Philistines in Gaza and to punish them, to find reasons, good reasons why they deserve to be punished, and punish them without redeeming the Jews from the Philistine oppression. So that's what you see in the Tanakh. But we never saw such a hanhoga from the B'nai. In no other instance do we ever see when God appointed a Goyish nation to exile the Jews and to persecute them, that God at the same time allowed them to be persecuted, even though he wanted the persecuting nation, in this case the Philistines, to be punished. We never saw such a hanhoga. So the question is, why was God doing this? It didn't make any sense. And of course, this partial redemption of the Jews, where the Philistines were being punished, but at the same time they still dominated the Jews, was a decree from God. And God never did this before. So what was going on? And that's why Shimshon Hagibor had to become superhuman, so that he can punish the entire nation of the Philistines on his own. That's why he became superhuman. So we understand from the story why he was a superhuman. But we don't understand the whole logic of the whole situation, where a persecuting nation of the Jews suddenly, even while they persecuted Jews, was supposed to be punished at the same time. So that's the question. What was going on? We have another question which is very powerful. The next question is very powerful, because we see that the first time that Shimshon is actually mentioned in the Torah Shimshon is actually not mentioned, but he's referred to in the Torah. Because when Yaakov Avinu, when Jacob, the patriarch of the Jews, was giving the blessings to his sons, to his 13 sons, two of them was Manasseh and Ephraim, the sons of Joseph. So there were 13 tribes in Israel. So Yaakov Avinu, Yaakov the patriarch, wanted to give a blessing to all of them. So when Yaakov Avinu came to the tribe of Dan, he gave Dan, his son, they gave Dan, one of his sons, a unusual blessing. And what he said was the following. He said that Dan, that fundamentally the Jews will someday be redeemed by two Mashiachs, two Messiahs, the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David. But when he gave the blessing, and that's contained in the blessing of Yehuda and the blessing of Yosef. From Yosef came the Mashiach ben Yosef, and from Yehuda came the Mashiach ben David. But what he said to Dan was something very strange, what Yaakov said to Dan. He said there will be a third Mashiach that will come from you, and that's called the Mashiach ben Dan. And why is there such a person as the Mashiach ben Dan? Because the Mashiach ben Dan does something which is extraordinary. When God asked the Mashiach to assist him so that he can punish the Jews, and the Mashiach would take on that punishment on himself, so that he would partially be in pain and be in suffering, and he would take on the suffering of the Jews when they sinned. Why? So that he can save the Jews. Because God said, if not, then I have to punish the Jews, possibly with annihilation. And I don't want to do this. So therefore, what I'm asking you, the Mashiach in general, the Messianic soul, you have to take on part of the suffering of the Jews themselves. And you fundamentally have to look like them. So eventually, you will not even be recognizable. So the Mashiach, therefore, is like a picture. It's like a photograph of the Jews where he actually looks like them based on their sins. And then he also accepts the punishment that should have gone to them. And Yaakov says, finally, that there will be a third Mashiach who will do this. The Mashiach ben David and the Mashiach ben Yosef, to a certain extent, accept the punishment on them for the Jews themselves, temporarily. And they are called Sovlei Chaloyim, those who suffer sicknesses and diseases and so on and so forth, and punishments, so that they take on this punishment instead of the Jews. And this is because of the request of God that he needs someone to take on their punishment temporarily, so he does not have to annihilate the Jews. But suddenly Yaakov says that there's a new Mashiach called the Mashiach ben Dan. And what is this Mashiach about? I once gave a shir on this a couple of weeks ago, on the whole inyan of Mashiach ben Dan. What the Mashiach ben Dan said to God is that he wants to take on the suffering for all the Jews that should not be worthy of Olam Haba. In other words, they deserve to be totally annihilated. There are certain Jews that deserve to be annihilated, and most of these Jews are called Moshim. Because what they do, they leave the Jewish people and they partner with the Goyim, and they report the Jews to the Goyim so that the Goyim could kill them or rob them. So in a certain way, they declare a certain loyalty to the Goyim that they're part of. They are Jews who partner with Goyim to punish or kill Jews. And these are called Moshim. And we know that these Moshim, Chazal Sevel Amalchinim Sikvor, that these kinds of Jews are no longer considered the Jews. They have really resigned from the Jewish people, and they have lost their chelik in Olam Haba. So God has decided even to try and save some of them. And which Mashiach is this? This is a new Mashiach called the Mashiach ben Dan. And he has said, what I will do is I will take on the punishment of all the Jews, even the ones that don't deserve to go to Olam Haba. I will take on their punishment and try and save them also. Please make sure that your sound is off while I give this share. So this is the Mashiach ben Dan. So the Mashiach is a third level of Mashiach, and in a certain way he's the greatest Mashiach of all, because he is the greatest of all the Sobel Chanoim. He suffers the most, because he is trying to save Jews who should be annihilated. And in order to do that, he has to take on an unusual amount of suffering to such an extent that when he lives and he tries to do that, you can't even recognize him. So Yaakov Avinu says there will come a time when there will be a Mashiach ben Don, because he will have to save the Jews or he will have to save someone from total annihilation. And he says that this person with Mashiach ben Don will come from the Shevet of Dan. And what he says is that Yaakov, what it basically is interpreted by the sages, is that Yaakov Avinu was referring to Shimshon Hagibor. That actually Shimshon Hagibor, who comes from the tribe of Dan, was the Mashiach ben Dan. And it was his job to save Jews, or to save Jews and prepare them to survive, and even to go to Olam Haba, although it would be a small level of Olam Haba. They, of course, would not be Zocher to have a great portion of Olam Haba, because they were Muslim. They were people who betrayed the Jews, but they would have some kind of chelet. And therefore, who would do this? Somebody who has to take on the suffering for these people. And this is the Mashiach ben Dan. And Yaakov Avinu was referring to Shimshon Hagibor when he gave the bracha to Dan, when he said that Dan, that only the Shevet of Dan, not the Shevet of David or the Shevet of Yosef, had a Mashiach who was so powerful that he could save all Jews, even those people who abandoned the Jews and became Muslim. So he said, there will become a person who's called Shimshon Hagibor. He implied this, and he will be what? He will be the final Mashiach itself. Now, we don't understand exactly what Shimshon Hagibor was doing. We don't understand this. But in certain ways, Yaakov Avinu was describing the person who would become the Mashiach ben Dan, who would have to save all these Jews. So according to Yaakov Avinu, the Mashiach ben Dan is a person who is a redeemer. He saves people. He is the last one who is the greatest redeemer of all. Yet when we look in the story of Shimshon Hagibor, we don't see anything like that. We see a person who was the Dayan from the Bezin, he was the head of the Bezin, and he went to live among the Philistines. He even married a Philistine woman. So in what way was he the Mashiach ben Dan? His job was not a job of redemption, his was a job of punishment. He was there to punish the Philistines for persecuting the Jews. What does this have to do with the Mashiach ben Dan? And this is the biggest question that we ask. And when we read this section about the Mashiach ben Dan, there's no indication of an answer. Not only that, the Shimshon Hagibor, so what Yaakov said, he saw that in the end, Shimshon Hagibor was the Mashiach ben Dan. But what it was, he saw that in the end, Shimshon Hagibor would be killed by the Philistines. He saw that he would die, and he would fail on his mission. That's right. That the Mashiach ben Dan would not be able to save whoever he was supposed to save, although we don't see anyone like that in the Tanakh. We do not see any people that he's saving. But in any case, he saw that he would fail in this mission, and therefore he said, since he failed, we have to look forward to the next Mashiach ben Dan. So there will become a person in the future who will be the Mashiach ben Dan, and he will save all the Jews who should never have been saved. Okay. And this will be in the future. And Yaakov Avinu said, Lishu Oscha, for your redemption, Kivisi Hashem, we all hope. So when he said, Lishu Oscha, Kivisi Hashem, Yaakov Avinu said, we therefore look forward to the last Mashiach ben Dan, who will finally be one who will suffer for all of Klal Yisrael, and he will be able to save everyone in Klal Yisrael, even the Muslim. But clearly Yaakov is referring to Shimshon Hagibor as a Mashiach ben Dan, as a redeemer, not as a person, as the punisher. So we don't understand what's going on, because you do not see this. Not only done, Shimshon Hagibor was a very unusual head of the Sanhedrin. Totally unusual. Why? Because normally when you go to the Shevet Don, let's say you lived in biblical times, and you went to the Shevet of Don, and you said to the Shevet, to the head of the Shevet, you said to them, who was not Shimshon, you said to them, oh, who is the Gadol Hador? Who is the greatest one in the generation? So they would tell you it's Shimshon. He is from our tribe and is the greatest Talmid Chacham in the generation. He was also a Navi, so he was a very great man. So then you would say to them, okay, I would like to meet him. So they say, well, that's not really possible. So you would say, why can't I meet Shimshon Hagibor if Shimshon is the Gadol Hador, the greatest person in Klal Yisrael? So what you would say, the reason why you can't see him, because he no longer lives, he doesn't really live with us. So you would say, well, where does he live? So you would say, he's living in the land of the Plishtim. In other words, he's living with the Goyim. He lives with them, he's married to them, and fundamentally, why does he live with them? So that he can persecute them, so that he can find reasons to punish them. So you would say, what? This is a Mashiach? Whoever heard of a Mashiach that lives with Goyim? So we see a very strange phenomena that we have never seen at all. The Gadol Hador, the greatest one in the generation, or the Poskim of Klal Yisrael, all live among the Jews. They don't live with Goyim, and they teach Jews, and they are Dayanim, and so on and so forth. But surely they do not live with Goyim, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't make sense. How could the Gadol Hador and the Navi Hador live with Goyim, and that's where he resides? So in other words, if you looked at Shimshon Hagibor, you would never say he would be Mashiach, because the Mashiach did not live with Goyim. So he would be unrecognizable. So in other words, not only was Shimshon strange because he was superhuman, he was strange also because even though he was the leader of the Jewish people, he never lived with the Jewish people. He lived with the Goyim, the Philistines, who were persecuting the Jews. And this is extremely unusual. So the whole life of Shimshon Hagibor would be such that we would never recognize him as a Gadol Hador. We knew he was a Gadol Hador because he was the head of the Sanhedrin, but his lifestyle was completely contrary to that of a Gadol Hador. So the whole story of Shimshon therefore doesn't make any sense. First of all, Shimshon Hagibor was the Mashiach when done, yet we don't see anything at all about him redeeming anyone. All we saw is that he was punishing the Plishtim. And not only that, we saw a man who lives with Goyim and who had the strength of a Superman so he can punish the Goyim by himself. This is so irregular for Klal Yisrael. So the question really is, Ian, what was Shimshon Hagibor doing? Why did God appoint such a man for such a task? The task of Shimshon Hagibor was so different than any leader of Klal Yisrael throughout its history that it's absolutely bizarre. Not only was he bizarre, his task was bizarre. That he was supposed to punish the Philistines, even while they were persecuting the Jews. And that he was superhuman. Why did God need this? So fundamentally, I've never really seen an explanation for this at all. He is the most bizarre leader of Klal Yisrael in all of their history. So the question we have to ask is, what can we know about Shimshon Hagibor? So today, I'm going to explain what he was doing, why he was a Mashiach when done, why he had to punish the Egyptians himself, and so on. The second bunch of questions we ask about the Plishtim. Who are they? Who were these Plishtim? Were they a high people or were they a low people? Well, what we see is that the Philistines persecuted the Jews while they were in Israel. Even though they lived in Israel with the Jews, they persecuted them. But how high were they spiritually? And what we see is that they were very great spiritually. In other words, they had very big neshamas. They were not a simple people. How do we see this? Because they went to war with the Jews. So the first question is, why were they angry at the Jews? It is, why were they so angry? They really were co-citizens of Israel. They lived in Israel just like the Jews lived in Israel. So what did the Jews do that made them so angry? And why did they declare war against the Jews? So what happened was almost like a civil war, where the residents of the land of Israel were at war with each other, the Jews against the Philistines. What was the purpose of the war? Why were the Philistines so angry at the Jews that they wanted to have a war with them? I'm sure that the Jews did not do anything against the Philistines. They did not deserve any kind of war, but the Philistines hated the Jews. They hated the Jews. Why did they hate the Jews? Why were they so angry? So we really don't know. The second thing is, what was the spiritual status of the Philistines? So we know it was great. They were very high souls, even though they worshipped idols. How do we know they had high souls? Because they went through the war and they won that war. They were finally vanquished by David HaMelech. How? Because at the time of King David, before he was a king, the Philistines declared war against the Jews. And in that war, there was a very big giant called Goliath, who was a giant. And he went to war with David HaMelech. He said, I will just fight with whoever you pick. And if I beat him, then the Philistines will have been considered to have won the war. So the battle between David and Goliath occurred because Goliath was a Philistine. But we see in another war, which they won also. And what they did was they killed the 3 sons of King Saul. King Shaul HaMelech, the king of Israel, lost his 3 sons to the Philistines in the war against them. That's right. He lost them. And that the Philistines not only went to war with Israel and they won, but that the Philistines were able to take the Aron HaBris, which was the casket which contained the luchos, the tablets of what God gave the Torah to Moshe. God gave the tablets of the 10 Commandments to Moshe Rabbeinu. He gave them the first tablets. He gave to Moshe Rabbeinu the first tablets on Shavuos, and that was the tablets that contained the 50th gate. But Moshe broke those tablets and put them in the casket called the Oren. And then God gave Moshe Rabbeinu the second tablets, which only had the 49 gates, but not the 50th. So therefore, the tablets which God gave to Moshe Rabbeinu, both sets, the first set on Shavuos and the second set on Yom Kippur, he gave it to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu put the tablets in the Oren, in the casket, which then was held in the Kodesh HaKadosh, in the Holy of Holies, in the Beis HaMikdash, and in the Mishkan. So what happened when the Philistines went to war with the Jews? What they did was what? They took the tablets from the Jews, and they held the tablets. They held the Oren HaBris for 6 months. That's right. Now you may say, so what? Why does this indicate a high spiritual status, that they had high souls? Because God would never allow the Oren HaBris to be in any nation who was not spiritually very high. So just like Rome, who was descended, who in some ways connected to Edom, to Esav, and therefore indicates their spiritual status, the Christians were obviously very high. They were not a typical Goyish nation because of the fact that they were able to take the Oren HaBris, the tablets, and hold it for 6 months, which was the holiest place, the holiest object in the Mishkan and in the Beis HaMikdash. They were able to hold it for 6 months, and they finally returned it because they had very bad luck while they had it. So they had to return it. They realized that they were making a big mistake by capturing the Oren, and they returned it to the Jews. But the very fact that they were able to hold it shows that they had a high spiritual status. So therefore we have 2 questions. Why were they so angry, the Jews, that they always wanted to make war with them and persecute them? And why did they were able to steal the Oren HaBris? What is going on? Why did God allow them to take the Oren HaBris? So there's a great mystery about the Philistines. These were not a usual people. And these were the people that Shimshon Hagibor had to go and live by and punish. So what's going on with the whole story of Shimshon Hagibor? What's going on with Shimshon? Who was he and why did he have this task? And what's going on with the Philistines? Why were they so angry at the Jews that they wanted to declare war? And why did God allow them to take the Oren HaBris? That's the second bunch of questions that has no answer. No one really explains what's going on. And finally, we have another question. After Shimshon Hagibor, after he died and so on and so forth, then there arose a king, the Jewish people suddenly decided that they wanted a king. They wanted to be like other nations, that they wanted a king. And they appointed, and Shimon appointed Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, to be king. So the question is, why did the Jews suddenly want a king? It didn't make any sense. They lived for a couple of 100 years just by being governed by judges. The Jews never had a king when they left the desert for 40 years. They never had a king. They were ruled by judges of the Sanhedrin, and they seemed to get along fine. And suddenly they said, now we want a king. Why? It didn't make sense. Not only that, Shlomo HaMelech suddenly took the tablets, the Oren Abris, and took a tablet, and he said, I will no longer allow the Beis HaMikdash to be the Mishkan, which was a temporary. The Mishkan in English is called the tabernacle. It was a kind of a mobile unit. The Jews would put it up and take it down as they were traveling in the desert. So it was a mobile Beis HaMikdash. It was not a fixed structure. It kept on being taken, put up, and put down. But Shlomo HaMelech decided to now build a building. The Beis HaMikdash itself was a building, and that building would have a Kodesh HaKadoshim. It would be so holy that that building would finally hold the tablets. It would hold the Oren Abris, the casket of the covenant between Israel and God, and it would be in a fixed building. That was the Beis HaMikdash. So Shlomo HaMelech, who's the son of King David, built the Beis HaMikdash. That was a fixed building which housed the Oren Abris and the Mizbeach, which Klal Yisrael used to make for the sacrifices to atone for their sins. Why did Shlomo HaMelech decide to build a Beis HaMikdash then? Why is it that no king, that none of the judges ever decided to take the Mishkan and to build an actual building? Why didn't he allow it to be a mobile unit where they would take up and put it down? In fact, when the Jews had the Mishkan for the first couple 100 years, it was at Shiloh, at a city in the West Bank called Shiloh, and that's where the Mishkan was. That was a holy city which contained the Mishkan. But the Mishkan itself was not a building. It was a temporary structure. It was kept as a mobile structure. And finally, when the Jews appointed a king and David, his son was King Shlomo, he decided to build it. Why did he suddenly decide to put the Beis HaMikdash as a fixed structure? So in other words, we really have no idea. It's not clear what's going on. When we learn Tanakh, when we learn the story of Shimshon, it doesn't make any sense. When we see who the Philistines are, why they're so angry at the Jews, and why they persecute the Jews, it doesn't make sense. And finally, we see after that, after Shimshon Hagibor, the Jews decided to make a real king over them. Why? Doesn't make sense. And Shlomo HaMelech decided to build the Beis HaMikdash, a fixed structure, instead of the Mishkan. We have no idea why. So now this Tisha B'Av, we fast because we are commemorating the destruction of the temple. What is this all about? What is the storyline? We have no idea. So this is what I want to explain. I'm going to attempt to explain the fundamental story of what was happening with Shimshon, the Philistines, and with the Jewish people. There is something that is going on which is not stated in Tanakh itself. It's implied. It's a deep mystery of what was happening. But somehow, it's nothing like that is written. So I would like to explain what I think was going on, and I will bring certain proofs of what I'm saying that I think is true. So therefore, these are the questions I'm trying to answer. All seven questions. Why was Shimshon Hagibor a Superman? Why does he want to punish the Philistines without redeeming the Jews? If Shimshon Hagibor was a Mashiach Madon, we don't see him redeeming anyone. All he's doing is punishing. That's not the job of a Mashiach Madon. Why were the Philistines angry with the Jews? They're always making war with them. What is the spiritual status of the Philistines that they have this position? Why suddenly did the Jews decide to make a king? And why did Shlomo Melech, the third king of Israel, decide to build a Beis Hamikdash? What is going on with all of this? These are 7 questions that I'm going to answer with this one theme and so on. Now, to truly answer these questions, we're going to have to go back in Jewish history to the story of Yosef and so on. The story of Joseph in the Bible and the Bereshis is a very strange story. Not that it didn't happen, it did happen. But we don't really understand why the story is mentioned in Sefer Bereshis in the Torah. Why? Because Yosef was sold by his brothers who were jealous of him. And they sold him, they put him on a caravan, and the caravan went to Egypt, and Yosef was sold as a slave to Egypt. Joseph the brother. That's what we know. And in Egypt, Joseph was a slave. And after he was a slave, because of a certain incident with the wife of Potiphar, Joseph became a prisoner. He was accused of attempting to rape the wife of Potiphar, and he was put in jail. He was put in jail for quite a while. So therefore, the story of Yosef is that he was first sold as a slave to Egypt, and he became a prisoner in Egypt. And then what happened was, Pharaoh had a dream, and he wanted to know what it was, and his own dream interpreters could not understand it. The Egyptian sorcerers could not interpret the dream of Pharaoh. So he heard that Yosef was able to interpret the dream, and Yosef told Pharaoh that the dream, after being called by Pharaoh, Yosef said that this dream indicates that God is about to bring a famine on Egypt. So Pharaoh said, if you could see this in the dream when no one else could see, I'm going to appoint you as his prime minister, and you will be almost as powerful as me. I will be more powerful to only in name only. You will be my prime minister. So Yosef went from being a prisoner, a slave, and then a prisoner, and a Hebrew slave at that, and a Hebrew prisoner at that, and suddenly Yosef, who's a foreigner, because he was a Hebrew, became the prime minister of Egypt. This was absolutely extraordinary. And this whole story of Yosef in Egypt, and Yosef died in Egypt. And the whole story of Yosef is mentioned in the Chumash of Bereshis. So the real question really what we ask is, this is a very interesting story, and of course the story which we'd like to know. But what does this have to do about the Torah? The Torah is a story of the Jews. It's a story of how the Jews started, who the patriarchs of Jews, and the history of the Jews themselves. Why do I have to know the story of Yosef? Since the story of Yosef is not about the Jews, it's about the Egyptians. Yosef developed a certain relationship with the Egyptians because he was sold as a slave and a prisoner, and he became prime minister of Egypt. So although this is a fascinating story, this has nothing to do with the Jews. The Jews are not specifically involved in the story of Yosef. So why does at least 1/4 of the Chumash Bereshis talk about the story of Yosef? The Chumash only talks about the story of which relates to the Jews. And since the whole story of Egypt and the famine that was supposed to happen to Egypt and so on happened to Yosef as a part of the story of Egypt, that has nothing to do with the Jews. So why does God reveal the Torah through the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu and tell us the story of Yosef in Mitzrayim? So fundamentally, I've never seen this question asked, but you have to ask the question of what relevance is that to the Jewish people? So the answer is very powerful, because the truth of the matter is, when God decided to give the Torah to Jews, remember, when Adam Rishon was first created, who was the first man, God gave him one mitzvah to observe. And had he done that one mitzvah of not eating from the Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, then the world would have changed and transformed into the eternal world called Olam Haba. That's right. Olam Haba was supposed to start with Adam Rishon if he had kept that mitzvah. But since he didn't keep that mitzvah and he sinned, therefore God decided to change the structure of mankind. And I've mentioned this several times. Therefore, what he decided to do was to tell mankind all of you now have to keep 7 mitzvahs, and these are called the 7 Noachide mitzvahs. But while the people who kept the 7 mitzvahs, if they would have kept the 7 mitzvahs, that's the generation of the flood and the generation of the Tower of Babel. These 2 generations, which existed for 20 generations and so on, if they had kept the 7 mitzvahs the way it was supposed to have been kept, God would have brought Olam Haba to the world. So there was a second opportunity for the future eternal world to appear. It could have appeared with either Adam, or it could have appeared who did not sin, or it could have appeared with the generation of the flood. And when God brought the flood and annihilated all these people, it could have also appeared with the generation of of the Tower of Babel. So in other words, Olam Haba should have been created before we even get to the patriarchs, because God would have been satisfied if mankind as a totality at that time would have kept one mitzvah with Adam Rishon, the first man that he created, and then with all of mankind after Adam Rishon by keeping the 7 mitzvahs of Bnei Noach. And all of these people were technically Jews, because the definition of a Jew is simply by performing a certain mitzvah, you are able to transform the universe and the world from what? A temporary location, which is called Olam Hazeh, this world, to a permanent location called Olam Haba, the future world, which is eternal. In the future world, which is eternal, there will be no time and no space. It's eternal. That means that there's no time anymore. Human beings lived as a pure soul, and they lived forever. And forever means that there's no time. So therefore, that's what was supposed to have happened at the beginning. God had no intention of necessarily giving the 630 mitzvahs, because it was not necessary to have 630 mitzvahs to obtain the possibility of Olam Haba. That's right. Either Adam could have created Olam Haba, or the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood, could have created Olam Haba, or the generation of the Tower of Babel, they could have. But they all lost that zchus. But they were all Jews, because they had the possibility to create eternity from what? From transiency. They could have made an eternal world that does not exist in time and space. And in that definition, they're called a Jew. So God changed his mind at that time when the patriarch Abraham was there. So God decided to change the definition of a Jew. How? Because God decided to give the 630 commandments called the Taryag Mitzvahs. And by giving the Taryag Mitzvahs, all of mankind will be Zocher for Olam Haba. Yeah, but they would have been Zocher before, even without doing those mitzvahs, just by doing 7 mitzvahs or 1 mitzvah. What was new? What was new is that 630 mitzvahs meant that they were guaranteed to go to Olam Haba. In other words, the first 20 generations of mankind was not guaranteed to go to Olam Haba. That if someone they sinned in such a way with the 1 mitzvah, where Adam Rishon, or if they sinned with the 7 mitzvahs of the generation of the flood, and the generation of what? Of the Tower of Babel, if they sinned with those mitzvahs, they would be annihilated, or they would be completely, their Jewishness would be taken away. The ability to create an eternal world would be confiscated from them. So God decided to change his mind. He decided to change the definition of a Jew. That if the Jews keep 630 mitzvahs, which is the Torah that was given to the Jews by Moshe Rabbeinu, it would guarantee that even if the Jews sinned, they would not lose that power. So the definition of the Jew, the Abrahamic Jew, the Jew that comes from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was a guaranteed Jew. Because the Gemara says this, that the Jews, Yisrael, that a Jew who's obligated to keep 630 mitzvahs, even though he sins, he's still considered a Jew of the Yisrael species. In other words, he's a guaranteed Jew. And how do we see this? Because part of the 630 mitzvahs were not simply mitzvahs of behaviors towards God, behaviors towards men. It's bringing sacrifices, having holidays, all kinds of mitzvahs that have to do with rehabilitation. Part of the 630 commandments had to do with mitzvahs that applied if you have to be rehabilitated. And if you don't have to rehabilitate yourself from a sin, you don't have to do the mitzvah. For example, there were certain sins that if you did the sin, you would bring certain korbanos. But if you never did the sin, you'd never have to bring korbanos. So there were two types of mitzvahs that were contained in the 630 mitzvahs. There were sins that that were performance related. You simply had to do them to earn olam haba. But there were other mitzvahs that had to do with rehabilitation. If you sinned in a certain way, you can remove the sin. You can by repenting and by bringing a sacrifice. So these are called rehabilitation mitzvahs. So these rehabilitation mitzvahs, there were hundreds of them, also guaranteed the possibility that any Jew who would be commanded to keep the 630 mitzvahs, he had literally a guarantee that it's almost impossible to lose the ability to construct the eternal world. That's right. So therefore, we Jews who keep the Taryag mitzvahs, who are commanded to keep the Torah, are different than the Jews before who are not commanded to keep the Torah, but were only commanded to keep seven mitzvahs. We have a guarantee, so we are on a much higher level. So what happened was, why did Joseph go into Mitzrayim? Because God initially wanted to bring the new status of a Jew, the status where the Jew would be guaranteed to all of mankind. That's right. He had no intention of giving it to the Jews, the sons of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham, and Yaakov alone. He wanted to give the Torah to everyone, so everyone would have that guarantee of Olam Haba. So what happened? God had said, the Medrash says that God went to every nation on earth and said to them, I want to give you new mitzvahs that not only have to be done in performance so that you can earn Olam Haba, but mitzvahs which will guarantee your right to earn Olam Haba because they are rehabilitation mitzvahs. And he offered these mitzvahs to everyone on earth, every nation on earth, and every nation refused. They refused to accept these mitzvahs. So God said, okay. So what happened is, I will not give you those mitzvahs. I would only give it to the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov. And they will become the new guaranteed Jew. And all of you will remain a goy. I will create a category, the new category of a goy. What is a goy? There has never existed a goy before Matan Torah. There was no such thing. Because what a goy is someone who keeps the original 7 mitzvahs of what he had before. But in keeping those 7 mitzvahs, he's not guaranteed anything at all. He can simply reside in the eternal world. He cannot construct it. He cannot transform the world based in time and space into an eternal world with no time and no space. In order to have this world, which has no time and space, it's considered eternal, in order to construct Olam Haba of that level, you have to be able to keep 630 mitzvahs, which guarantee your position in Olam Haba. And therefore, when all the nations of the world refused to accept the Taryag mitzvahs, they wanted to remain people who simply resided in Olam Haba, but they did not want to construct it. They don't have the source of the spiritual potential to construct eternity. Therefore, if the Jews don't bring eternity to them by performance of 630 mitzvahs, there is no eternity in the world. Because the Jews are the gatekeepers. The Jews of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the gatekeepers to the eternal world. And if the Jews don't construct it, because they have the only power to construct it, there is no Olam Haba, and God will annihilate everyone. So the Jewish people are gatekeepers because they're the only ones who have that guarantee. God wanted to give that guarantee to everyone, but the whole world rejected it. So therefore, God made them goyim. Goyim are simply people who are terrestrial zulasos. They are terrestrial human beings. They can earn by doing the 7 mitzvahs. They can only earn to reside in Olam Haba once constructed by the Jews. So therefore, they all became goyim, and that's why Joseph went to Mitzrayim. Why? Because it was decreed that a Jew would have to go to Egypt right after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he would have to go to Egypt, not as a slave and not as a prisoner, but he was supposed to go to Egypt. and become prime minister of Egypt. That's right. How Joseph would have become the prime minister without having been enslaved or imprisoned, we don't know. What would force God to make Joseph into a slave and a prisoner were certain accusations against the brothers. The brothers earned a sin by fundamentally kidnapping him and selling him as a slave. That had to do with certain sins that they did. And because of those sins, Joseph had to go to Egypt as a slave and as a prisoner. But what was he supposed to do in Egypt? He was supposed to convince the Goyim to convert to the guaranteed Jew. He was the one that was sent by God to Egypt to entice Egypt to become Jewish. Why? Because God wanted to make all of mankind into guaranteed Jews. And Yosef was the one who was supposed to makarev Egypt. That's right. The fundamental job of Yosef HaTzadik was to makarev, was to bring the Egyptians and the Egyptians was the greatest nation in the world at that time. So he was supposed to makarev Egypt to become what? To accept the Torah with the Jews. So the Jews would never have to confront Egypt. Egypt would come with the Jews together and they would receive the Torah. That's right. The intention of God was that the Egyptians should go with the Jews and receive the Torah at Sinai, because he wanted everyone to become Jewish and receive the guaranteed mitzvahs, which are rehabilitative and not only performance related. But the Egyptians refused. So the question is, was Joseph successful? If Joseph's job was to guarantee it, were they successful? And the answer is, yes, he was. That's right. Joseph successfully converted the Egyptians to accept the Torah at first. That's right. Even though the Torah doesn't actually say this. It doesn't say this directly. But how do we know this? How do we know that the Egyptians were already ready to become Jewish? How do we know such a thing? Why? Because we know this. Because when Yaakov Avinu came down to Egypt, because Yosef was there, and he wanted to see Yosef again, and when he came to Egypt, and Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our patriarch, when he went to Pharaoh, and he said, I am the father of Yosef. So you know what Pharaoh did? Pharaoh said to Yaakov, bless me, give me a blessing. And this would have been impossible. Yaakov was a Hebrew. He was a foreigner. And Yaakov had no chashivas, he had no significance in the eyes of Pharaoh, who was considered a god. So how could a person who's considered a god ask for a blessing from a foreigner, a person of no significance? It's impossible. Pharaoh would never have asked a foreigner and a person like Yosef, or a commoner, or a citizen to take a blessing, because Pharaoh is considered a god. But the fact that Pharaoh asked Yaakov for a blessing means that Pharaoh accepted the fact that Yaakov was a tzaddik, and that the purpose of Yaakov by being Jewish was to create the eternal world, and that he was ready to accept that position. So therefore we see indirectly that Paro accepted it, and the fact that Paro made Joseph HaTzadik into prime minister of Egypt, who was a Hebrew slave, it means that Paro told his people, you have to accept that. And how do we know that Egypt accepted it? Because Joseph HaTzadik, before he gave food to Egypt, he forced every Egyptian to have a bris, to have a circumcision. Why would he force all the Egyptians to take a circumcision? Well, that indicates that Joseph HaTzadik wanted to make every Egyptian into a Jew. That's why he wanted them to enter into the covenant of Abraham, where you become a Jew when you have a bris milah. That's right. Joseph wanted to give a bris milah, a circumcision, to every Egyptian. But the Egyptians were goyim. No, they weren't. We make a very big mistake. We assume that the Egyptians were goyim, but they weren't goyim. There was no such thing as a goy at the time of Yosef. Every person on earth was a Jew, but he was a Jew that would bring olam haba to 7 mitzvahs. He simply wanted to convert every goy, or not every goy. He wanted to convert every Noachide. Every person on earth was a Noachide Jew. He could make olam haba with 7 mitzvahs. And Yosef wanted to tell Paro that now God wanted to change this to 630 mitzvahs and change the deal. He changed the covenant, so therefore he wanted every Egyptian to be circumcised. Why? because then he would convert them all. And Paro accepted that because he told the Egyptian people that they should all submit to Yosef's request. But what was the request? The request of Yosef to the Egyptians was through giving them the mitzvah of circumcision to make them all Jewish, to accept 613 commandments, and thereby making all of mankind converted. Well, why would every other nation become Jewish? Maybe the Egyptians would become Jewish, but why would every other nation? Because the Egyptians were the greatest nation on earth, the most powerful nation, and the greatest nation of sorcery. 90% of the chokmah of sorcery was given to the Egyptians. They were the greatest idol worshippers in the world. They were the greatest sorcerers in the world. And the proof of that is the ability to build pyramids. There are over 100 pyramids in Egypt. And they say the Pyramid of Giza is the greatest pyramid of all. It has 2.5 million stones, each stone weighing many tons. And they say, how could the Egyptians have built and put 2.5 million stones together in a structure where you can't even fit a card between each stone? It would be impossible to do this. And archaeologists are trying to figure out how they did it, but they're all mistaken. The Egyptians were able to build the pyramids, and they built over 100 of them. How? Because of their knowledge of sorcery. That's how. Because they say to build a pyramid of the same Pyramid of Giza at the time they built it, which is 2500 BCE, which is only 1,000 years after Adam Rishon. How were they able to build such a pyramid when they didn't even have a wheel? And the answer is through sorcery, because it says to build 2.5 million stones and place one on top of the other. In terms of what? In terms of a pyramid, where each stone it weighs tons and tons. Would have taken, you had to build 2.5 million stones. Would take 5 minutes per stone to cut it and then to put it on top of another stone. This is impossible to have done. So the only way the Egyptians could have built over 100 pyramids and so on is through sorcery. But of course, archaeologists will not mention this or agree to this. But it was the job of Yosef HaTzadik to take him away from sorcery and idol worship and to make them Jews again, but Jews who would observe 613 commandments and so on. Now, how do we know that the Egyptians accepted Yosef, besides that he wanted them all circumcised? Because there's a pasuk in Shimon that says that Paro no longer knew Yosef. It says that he forgot who Yosef was. That Paro forgot who Yosef was. But that's not possible, because Yosef HaTzadik saved Mitzrayim from a disastrous famine. So how could he forget? It's like America forgetting who George Washington is. So what it means is that Paro did not forget who Yosef was. He knew very well that Yosef was a tzaddik. And they buried Yosef underneath the Nile River. So in his house, the Nile would overflow constantly. So they knew who Yosef was. But what happened? Because Paro decided suddenly to backtrack and not become Jewish. Why? Because the Jews themselves, why does it say that Paro no longer knew Yosef? That Paro forgot who Yosef was? Because it says Yaakov Avinu knew who Yosef was, but he changed his mind about the Jews. Why? Because it's the first time when the Jews went into Egypt, they were holy. They were the sons of the 12 tribes. But after a while, the Jews themselves started worshiping the idols of Egypt. They believed in Amun-Ra, the chief god of the Egyptians, in the sun god of Egypt. So the Jews themselves started worshiping idols. So when they started worshiping idols, Paro said, well, what about these Jews? At first they were holy people as long as the tribes were alive. But now that all the tribes, the people of the tribes, Yehuda and Dan and Yisachar and Zebulun and Naphtali and so on, now that they all died, now the Jews are worshiping our idols. So therefore they're not a holy people. They're just like us. They're regular people. And since they're regular people, they can suddenly turn on us and side with Goyim, other nations who want to declare war against us, and we can't trust them. So therefore, we have to all put them in slavery. So therefore, Egypt changed its mind about becoming Jewish because of the fact that the Jews worship the idols themselves just like the Egyptians. So Pharaoh lost trust in them. But it's obviously also Pharaoh wanted to go back to his idols, and the Egyptians wanted to go back to his idols. But he had a good excuse that since the Jews are worshiping these idols, he had no reason to become Jewish. So that's why Joseph failed. At first he succeeded, and the Egyptians were willing to become Jewish with the Jews together and receive the Torah, and then the Egyptians changed their mind, and they went back to their idols and their sorcery, because the Jews did likewise. So therefore, when Moshe Rabbeinu came later on to give the Torah to the Jews, he had to fight the Egyptians. That's right, he was in a conflict with the Egyptians, and he had to bring 10 plagues on the Egyptians to convince them that this is what God wants. God wants who gives the Torah. So the only ones who went to Mount Sinai were the Jews, not the Egyptians. But the Jews were partly responsible for the refusal of the Egyptians to become Jewish. So now we understand why the story of Yosef is in the Torah, because that story is part of the plan of God to make all the people in the world Jews who would be guaranteed through the 630 mitzvahs to build Olam Haba. Now, based on this story, now that you understand the significance of Yosef, that all of mankind was Jewish before Mount Torah, and they became Jewish only in terms of 7 mitzvahs. But after Yosef went to Mitzrayim, he wanted to convince them to become Jewish with a guaranteed quality, so they would have 630 mitzvahs and build Olam Haba, but they refused. So that's the story of Yosef. He went to Egypt to be Makar of Egypt. That's the reason why he went to Egypt. And now that we know what the story of Yosef was, we can begin to understand the story of Shimshon. So I have to apologize because I had to say this. I have to tell you first the story of Yosef for you to understand the story of Shimshon. So then who was Shimshon? So the answer is Yaakov Avinu was right. He saw in the Nebuah that Shimshon, Samson, the Superman, was really the Mashiach ben Don. It was his job, what? To save mankind who had the din of a Moshe, right? Why? What? Mashiach ben Don was supposed to save Jews. This is something you have to know. Because even though by Yosef HaTzadik, even though the Egyptians refused to become Jewish, and they wanted to worship their idols, so therefore Moshe had to redeem the Jews alone and not with the Egyptians. But that doesn't mean that God gave up on the Egyptians. You see, God did not give up. You see, you have to understand something. When God wants to give you an opportunity, in this case, he wanted to give the Jews of 7 mitzvahs, which include the Egyptians, the opportunity to establish Olam Haba as a guaranteed event. So even though the Egyptians refuse it, that doesn't mean that God retracts the offer. That's not so. Many times what God does is he leaves the offer standing. In other words, he does not retract the offer. He still had the hope of eventually being Makar of all the Goyim. In other words, he hoped that even though Egypt refused to be Jewish, refused to keep 630 commandments, he hoped that later on in the future, that the Egyptians would not have a promise of what a Jew is, but they would actually see the Jews. You know what God would do? He would repeat the event of Yetzias Mitzrayim. He would repeat the event of Yosef HaTzadik coming to Egypt and Moshe Rabbeinu coming to Egypt to try and Makar. Just like Yosef tried to Makar, he tried to make the Egyptians Jewish, and at first he succeeded. And Moshe Rabbeinu also tried. Because Moshe Rabbeinu did not bring plagues that the Egyptians could not understand on Egypt. When he brought the plague of blood and the plague of the frogs, these were plagues that the Egyptians themselves could do. So Moshe Rabbeinu started with the plague in a gentle way. He brought plagues that the Egyptians, through their sorcery, could also duplicate. Why? Because he gently wanted to convince the Egyptians that they should be Makar, that they should do tshuva for enslaving the Jews and be Makar, that they should become Jewish. At first, Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to still allow the Egyptians. Moshe Rabbeinu did not want to punish the Egyptians because of what they were doing to the Jews alone. He wanted to also macabre the Egyptians. So therefore he gave them gentle plagues that they themselves were able to do. We know the Egyptians were the greatest sorcerers because when Moshe threw down his staff, it became a snake. The Egyptians also threw down their staffs and they became snakes. So the question is, how were the Egyptians able to take a staff of wood and make it into a serpent? That's a living thing. How could you take an inorganic wood and make it, because it was a staff, and make it suddenly into a snake? Because they did this through magic. So we see that the Egyptians had the ability to do sorcery, magic in the same time, because at that time they were prophets and they were sorcerers. They were men who were very holy or very knowledgeable about spirituality. So therefore, what Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to do was convince the Egyptians to again take the promise of Yosef HaTzadik, that it was a mistake what the Jews made, and that the Jews would do tshuva on worshipping idols, and that the Egyptians should also do tshuva and accept the opportunity to become Jewish and guaranteed sulasai. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu did that. But when Paro refused, when he said to Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm not going to do it, we will still be sorcerers and idol worshippers, and I'm not interested in anything you have to say. So suddenly, therefore, Moshe started giving plagues that the Egyptians could not do to show them that his power came from God. And finally, when he did the plague of darkness, he showed them that suddenly he was no longer a prophet, simply that his whole power came from God. Why? Because the chief god of the Egyptians was Amun-Ra, the sun god. And in the plague of darkness, he canceled the sun, and it was totally dark. And the Egyptians said, how could it be? How could Moshe Rabbeinu cancel Amun-Ra, our greatest god, who's the god of the sun? So they realized that what Moshe Rabbeinu was doing was beyond their God. So that means that Moshe Rabbeinu must be serving the only real God, God himself, the one who was the master of the universe. So that's when they realized that they were completely wrong. And the next plague was the plague of the firstborn, because the Jews became the firstborn of the world as opposed to the Egyptians. So fundamentally, Moshe Rabbeinu himself wanted to macabre the Egyptians also. He did not want to destroy them. He wanted to destroy them only because they refused. And then finally, not only they refused to become Jews, but they wanted to recapture the Jews by running after them to go to the Yam Suf, to the Sea of Yam Suf, and they wanted to recapture the Jews to enslave them again. So that's when God decided, since they want to recapture the Jews and make them, so not only are they going to not macabre, not only will you not be successful with making them Jews again, but you will destroy, I will destroy them. So God destroyed them at Kriyas Yam Suf. So we see that the story of Yeshiva's time was very different than what we understand. That God did not have the intention to initially destroy the Egyptians, but to continue the work of Kirub that started with Yosef HaTzadik. But Moshe Rabbeinu failed, and he took the Jews to Sinai alone. So what was the story of Shimshon? Shimshon was actually the Moshe Rabbeinu of that generation. That's right. Why? Because Shimshon went down into the Philistines. You see, we see that the Philistines were very great souls because they were all the Holy Oren. That told us that the Philistines were very great spiritual people. They were not a spiritual people, even though they worshipped the idols. The Philistines were the Egyptians, were like the Egyptians of the time of Shimshon. And God still had the desire to make them into Jews. That's right. He accepted the Egyptian decree that they would not be Jews. But God did not retract the opportunity and gave them the opportunity again. So Shimshon would go down and to macabre the Philistines. That's why. So why did he make Shimshon so strong? Not to punish the Philistines. The reason why Shimshon Hagibor was a superman, because God had to show them that Shimshon Hagibor was not simply a tzaddik. Because they would never accept from Shimshon Hagibor what? That he was a Jew, a special man. Why did God make Shimshon Hagibor not only a strength, but that strength would come from his Nazirus? Because Shimshon Hagibor was a Nazir from birth and a holy man. So God therefore made him a very powerful man. Why? So that the Philistines would see Shimshon Hagibor as a man of God. So he wanted to make Shimshon Hagibor unusual, to be like the Moshe Rabbeinu. Shimshon Hagibor was like the Moshe Rabbeinu of that generation. So he would try and make the Philistines into Jews. That's right. God did not retract the opportunity. He just postponed the opportunity for a later generation, because he felt that maybe the Egyptians cannot become Jews because they don't know what they're in for. But now that they see Jews, now that they see a man like Shimshon, who they knew was holy, they knew Shimshon Hagibor was a Nazarite. They knew he was a very big tzaddik. Obviously, he was Mashiach ben Don. He had to be a very big tzaddik. So Shimshon Hagibor therefore lived by the Egyptians. Why? Because he had to demonstrate what the Jewish religion is, the Taryag Mitzvahs, by showing that it leads to a certain Kedusha, that the Kedusha of a Jew is greater than the status of a Goy. And therefore, that just like he was great, and therefore, how did they know he was great? Because they saw that from the Zerus, from being a Nazir, by being a holy person, he became a Superman. And they knew, the Philistines knew that Shimshon Hagibor was like the Moshe Rabbeinu of that time. And why did God do that? Not to take revenge on the Philistines, but to makar them, to make them Jewish, to make them do what the Egyptians failed to do. But in order to get them to become Jewish, he had to make Shimshon a very special person, so that his strength would be extremely unusual. They knew, the Philistines, that this was a man of God. They knew that. And they knew that it came because he was a Nazir, but they didn't know where his strength came from. But they knew it was from God. So therefore, Shimshon Hagibor would demonstrate by his behavior, by his sitkis, the kedusha of a Jew, by doing the Taryag Mitzvahs. That was the purpose of Shimshon. But what happened? The Philistines wanted to be just like the Egyptians. They did not want to leave their idol worship. Even though they saw Shimshon as the spectacular Jew who kept the Torah and mitzvahs, and they saw the spectacular nature of Shimshon Hagibor, like he was the Moshe Rabbeinu of that door, they still wanted to keep the Egyptians. So they refused to acknowledge Shimshon as the tzaddik that he was. So therefore, what they wanted to do, why were they angry with the Jews? Because they were angry at the Torah, they were angry at the Taryag Mitzvahs, because Shimshon was trying to make them Jews. And they didn't want to become Jews, they wanted to be over the Rezor with the magic that they were able to do. But they were holy people, because why? Because they were able to hold the Oren. But they only wanted to hold the Oren by keeping Avodah Zorah. That's why they put the Oren next to the Avodah Zorah of Dagon. Dagon was the god of the Philistines, and they used to put the Oren next to Dagon. Because rather than having the Jews, the Oren, convert Dagon and eliminate idol worship, they wanted Dagon, the idol, to change the Oren, the reverse. So God saw from the Philistines that there's no way finally that the Philistines will convert. They will not accept the Taryag Mitzvahs. So finally God said, now I'm going to retract the possibility that Egypt will become Jewish, that mankind will become Jewish. I'm going to retract it. So what did he do? God retracted the possibility of a Goy becoming Jewish. So even though that possibility existed after Yetzias Mitzrayim and after Yam Suf, that possibility of a Goy, who they became because they followed Egypt, the possibility that a Goy can become Jewish and be Zocher to the Kedusha of Torah was still there. God simply waited, postponed the possibility for a later time until Shimshon, so that they would observe the behavior of Shimshon and be impressed with he's the man of God. So that's why they hated the Jews, because they hated the Kedusha, they hated the Torah of the Jews. They refused to give up their idol worship, and that's why they continuously made war against them. And in a certain sense, they persecuted the Jews to indicate to the Jews, we are stronger than you. Even though we worship idols and you worship Torah, but we're stronger than you. because God wanted to allow the Egyptians to truly have free will. So what happened? So the Philistines were confused. On one level, they saw Shimshon, and they saw a man of God and the strength of what comes from a man of God, and another, what this person is. But at the same time, they also saw something which reinforced the Yetzer Hara. Because why are they persecuting the Jews? So they thought it's because they're stronger than the Jews. So from one standpoint, by observing Shimshon, they saw the value and the power of a Jew. So this would want them to be Makav. But at the same time, they also realized that they could persecute the Jews. So they saw the Jews as weaker than their Avodah Zorah. That Dagon was more powerful than the God of the Jews. Why? Because God wanted to give them an escape clause. He wanted to give them a reason why they shouldn't become the Jews. So they would choose between two possibilities. Either seeing Shimshon as representative of the model of what a Jew could become. So Shimshon was spectacular. That's right, from his strength and his citrus. But at the same time, he allowed the Philistines to hold the Jews on them because the Jews were also doing sins. So he allowed the Philistines to capture the Jews and persecute them, so they would have suddenly a feeling that they are stronger than Jews. And they had to choose between two possibilities. And the possibility they chose was they would not become the Jews, and they would war with the Jews. On the contrary, why? Why did they want to war? Because they needed to war with the Jews. They needed to see the Jews as adversaries so that they could demonstrate to Jews that there's a good reason why they don't want to become Jewish, because they control the Jews. The very fact that they can control and persecute the Jews showed them that Dagon was more powerful than the Jewish God. They listened to the Yetzer Hara and so on. So this was the conflict that was going on with the Philistines. The Philistines were confused between these two possibilities. Either would become like Shimshon or would become like the persecutors of Jews, and they chose to become the persecutors of the Jews and to remain with idol worship. Now you see something powerful, that the story of Shimshon is not a story simply of a man who wants to take revenge because they persecuted the Jews. That's not the story. The story is that Shimshon was supposed to Makar them, because the promise of the Egyptians becoming Jews was still extant. The Benishim still had a hope that the Goyim would leave becoming a Goyim through 7 mitzvahs, and then he would take on the Tayed mitzvahs and become Jewish. But when he saw that the Philistines completely defied that and refused to do that, they refused to see the example of Shimshon Hagibor, and they wanted to destroy the Jews or destroy Shimshon Hagibor and consider themselves stronger than the Jews. He saw that it was hopeless, so God retracted the possibility that the Goyim would eventually become Jews. So it was an international event. The story of Shimshon Hagibor was not simply a local event or a current event at that time. It was an international event. God was simply trying to resurrect the Goyim to finally accept the guaranteed bliss. He was trying to make them part of the bliss of what a Jew is. But they refused. So then God finally retracted. And then what happened was the possibility of a Goy becoming Jewish as a nation was finished. God retracted. So never again were the Goyim able to become Jewish as a nation. But God still allowed that possibility as an individual. So God said to the Jews, you have to accept Goyim will become Jews and are willing to keep the tithe riches as individuals. That I will not take away from them. I will always keep that possibility relevant. So God did not retract it completely. The individual can become a Jew, but never a nation again. But the fact that the nation should become Jewish, that was retracted. And therefore, for the first time in human history, the Goy became a visible part of the world's population. Now the population of the world became permanently Jew with Tayed mitzvahs and Goyim with 7 mitzvahs. But that did not become true until Shimshon Hagibor. It did not become true with Egypt. The possibility was still open, but it was retracted at the time of that. So Shimshon Hagibor, the story of Shimshon Hagibor, So why did Shimshon Hagibor punish the Philistines? Because he wanted to show them that they should, just like Moshe Rabbeinu punished the Egyptians because they refused to be Makarev, because the last couple of plagues that he gave, the Egyptians saw that this was not done by a sorcerer, this is from God. So this was Shimshon also, by practicing superhuman strength, demonstrated to the Philistines that they have to do this or else they would remain goyim forever. So therefore we see an incredible thing, that the story of Shimshon is not a story of Shimshon simply trying to punish the Philistines who held the Jews in their domination. No, that's not what it was. It was an attempt by Shimshon Hagibor to makarev the Philistines and to give the Philistines the option of becoming Jews or not. So Shimshon Hagibor was the Mashiach ben Don. That's right. He was like a Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was the Mashiach ben Yosef that was trying to makarev the Goyim to become Jews. So Shimshon was the Moshe Rabbeinu of his generation that tried to finally give the Goyim the last opportunity as a nation to become Jewish and accept and become guaranteed Zulasoi. This is the real story of Shimshon. But he punished them, of course, every time they did something to him personally. He had to punish them to show them that God would not tolerate that he, with his superhuman strength, could alone punish the Egyptians. So Shimshon was a one-man Moshe Rabbeinu. He alone, physically and militarily, could destroy the Philistines. And this had to be from God. And the Philistines realized that the only way they can stay as idol worshippers is they had to destroy Samson. But they knew Samson was a man of God, and they knew it had something to do with his Naziris, but they didn't know where it came from. So when when Shimshon Hagibor told Delilah the secret, and Delilah told the Philistines the secret of Shimshon's power, they cut off his hair. So in that way, they finally were able to blind him, and they killed him. But even in killing him, in the end, he didn't die alone. He pulled down the two towers, the two pillars that held up the entire temple of the Philistines. And he took thousands and thousands of Philistines with him. He said, Thomas Nafshim and Philistines. So since I cannot makarev the Philistines, I will die with them. And their death would be, on a certain level, be their kapora. So therefore he will allow the Goyim to survive as Goyim. It was only the death of the Philistines in the temple through Shimshon Hagibor that allowed the Goyim to remain as Goyim to the end of human history. So we see that the story of Shimshon Hagibor and the Philistines is a very deep story of international relevance. That was the last time that a Goy could become a Yid. And the story of Shimshon with the Philistines is the story of not only the Philistines refusing to become a Jews, but actually through their death being able to hold the source that the Goyim would remain to the end of time. So now we certainly understand now I can answer not only why the Philistines were angry with the Jews, because they refused to become things, and not only their status, and now I understand that Shimshon was really a Mashiach ben David, and why he was so superhuman in strength, because his was the opportunity of Yosef HaTzadik and Moshe Rabbeinu to makarev them, the Goyim. And he was the last one that could have made them into Jews had they been willing to do that. Now I will try and answer the last question. Why did the Jews want a king? Now we understand. Why did they want a king? Because God decided after Shimshon Hagibor, after he died and the Philistines died, that no longer would the Goyim ever exceed and accept the rule of becoming a Jew. That promise, that opportunity was retracted by God. So therefore the Jews realized that they were alone. You see, somehow the Jews knew this. That's why they tolerated Shimshon. Why did the Jews at the time of the Shoftim, why did they tolerate a man like Shimshon? Because they understood what he was doing. That's why they tolerated living among the Goyim. They tolerated that he was the Moshe Rabbeinu of that door, and they understood what he was trying to do. Shimshon was trying to make the Goyim into Jews. They understood this. But once the Philistines all died, and they understood that God retracted this thing, they understood that they were alone in the world. No, the Goyim would never become Jews as a nation. They understood that this is what happened. So now that they were alone, they wanted to become a nation with a sovereignty. And a nation with a sovereignty has a king. There is no nation that has rulers or governed of judges. This doesn't exist. Every nation has a president, has an army, has a king, and so on. That's what makes a nation, not a nation which simply has Shoftim, Dayanim as leaders. No nation has Dayanim as leaders. They have a president as a leader, a chief executive. So the Jews said, now that we are a nation alone, we will no longer partner with the Goyim to become Jews, but we are alone a nation, because God has attracted the opportunity where the Philistines was Jewish. So therefore, we want a king. We want to be like every other nation. We accept our status of being alone with the tired mitzvahs, but we want a king to represent this nation. So even though God thought it was a mistake, because a king has his own yetzaros, and the kings would cause great sorrows for Klal Yisrael, he allowed them to do it because the logic was true. They would now be, from now on to the end of history, to the last Mashiach, the Jews, having experienced Shimshon as Mashiach Madon to try and makal the Goyim, to make them Jews, they realized it was over, and that they were now a sovereign nation alone. So therefore they wanted a king to represent that new sovereignty. So he allowed the Jews to take a king. And that also explains why Shlomo Melech built the Beis HaMikdash. Because in a certain way, the fact that the Jews alone would be people with Tayyad mitzvahs meant that at a certain level, mankind as an entirety has descended. That's right. What we don't understand is God wanted the Goyim to become Jews. He wanted to save all his children. God's children is everyone, the Jews and the Goyim. God also loves Goyim, and he wants them to all become guaranteed Jews. So God was very saddened that the Philistines refused to do it and refused to influence mankind to become Jews. He was very saddened because it means that the Goyim could never construct Olam Haba. They could just live there. But the Jews would from now on be the only nation of all the people on earth, of all the Zulasais, where the Zulasai would only truly be the Jews. So the Jews realized that they would only be the two components of the Zulasai. So they wanted a king. But they realized that this was a Yerida. This was a descent from mankind as a totality. So the Zulasai as a whole. So in a certain sense, the fact that the Jews appointed a king, and therefore they felt that they now lose the distinction. They gained the distinction by having the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Mishkan would be converted to a fixed institution, where the Oren Abris would be in a fixed building. So we think that was a Mila. That was not a Mila, that was a Chasson. The fact that God converted the Beis HaMikdash, the fact that God converted the Mishkan, which is only a temporary habitat, so that it can always again become what? The Shekhinah in their hearts. The original intent of God in having the Beis HaMikdash or Mishkan was that God did not want the Shekhinah to be sure to occupy a house, a physical place. He wanted the Shekhinah to be in the heart of every Jew. That's where the Shekhinah belongs. It belongs in the heart and the mind of every Jew. Every Jew is supposed to be a Beis HaMikdash himself. The Beis HaMikdash is really a human status, it's a human equivalent. God wanted the Jew himself to be a Beis HaMikdash, to have the Shekhinah in the heart of Yizorkat Olam Haba. So God making the Shekhinah to inhabit a building was a letdown, was a yerida. And finally, when that building became from a mobile building to a fixed building, it went down even further. So when the Jews suddenly became the only nation in the world which can construct a temple, this was the yerida for the Zulasai. Because now the Zulasai will be composed of two elements, the Jew who can construct Olam Haba and the Goy who can reside in Olam Haba. But this was a descent for mankind. It was a descent for the Zulasai. Mankind went down, because since mankind went down, so therefore the place where the Shina resided also went down. It became a building. It was no longer a mobile building, which was only temporary, which can then return in a person's heart, but now it became permanent building. The Beis HaMikdash became a permanent building. So Shlomo HaMelech realized that it was a descent from the Jews, that the fact that the Jews can build a fixed building to signify that only they would be Zercha to the Shina. Because only a person who's Zercha to have the Shina in the midst can build Olam Haba. That's the significance of the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash was a simon to the Jews, that whoever possessed that building indicated who can construct Olam Haba. And the fact that it became a permanent fixture among the Jews indicates that from now on, they would be the only nation with a sovereign status and the ability to build Olam Haba. And there would be a class of people called a Goy that could not build Olam Haba. He would lose that distinction. So that's why Shlomo HaMelech built the temple as a descent of the Zulasai, not as an ascent. But at the same time, it was a schos, because the Jews retained the status of a Jew, ben Tayyag, the Jew who was worthy of Tayyag mitzvahs, who, in other words, was worthy of being the person who would have the total authority to build Olam Haba, an environment, a universe without time or space. That's what Olam Haba is, an eternal universe. And that task would only be given to the Jews. And the symbol of that task, that it was only given to the Jews, was a symbol that the Shekhinah would show on a building in Jerusalem, which is the city of God. Zion. What is Zion? Zion. Zion. Zion means that the Shekhinah resides in a physical location. That's the meaning of Zion. And it says, Hamachzir Shechinoso Zion. Jerusalem became the city of Zion, of Zion, of redemption, because it was the only place where Olam Haba can be constructed. It was the only place that allowed the tachlis of being a Jew to be truly done. But this could only be done after Shimshon Hagibor, because Shimshon Hagibor was the last man who was a Mashiach. He was a Mashiach when done. He tried to redeem the Goyim, because God still hoped that the Goyim, the Plishtim, would become Jews, and therefore influence mankind become Jews also, because they would see who Shimshon was, that he was superhuman coming from God, and that he was a Nazir, he was a man of great Kedusha. And that's why the Jews tolerated Shimshon Hagibor, and they understood what he was trying to do. So suddenly we understand that the story of Shimshon Hagibor was a completely different story as it's presented in Tanakh. The Tanakh is not telling you a story of one man with a one nation. No, it's telling a story internationally of one part of the Zulasai. It was not the story of a single nation. It was a story of the Zulasai. That the possibility of the Zulasai being completely Jewish from Tayyag mitzvahs, where they would be guaranteed to build Olam Haba, this was the last possibility where this could be done, and it was to be done through the possibility of Shimshon Hagibor. He was the Moshe Rabbeinu of that generation. And somehow the Plishtim was so powerful and so elevated that even though they were idol worshippers, they could have been the nation that can convert other nations to become Jewish. So it's the Zulasai who's the target of Shimshon, not the Philistines. It was the Zulasai himself that the Zulasai, the son of 7 mitzvahs, will become the Zulasai, the son of 630 mitzvahs. And therefore, all of mankind would have benefited from the messenger of Shimshon Hagibor. So the story of Shimshon is an international city. It's a spiritual story that has to do with the very act of creation. God created mankind so that all of mankind would again have the ability to construct Olam Haba. God wanted the total Zulosoi to have the ability to be guaranteed Olam Haba and not lose it like the Bnei Noach and Adam Arishan lost it. They had no guarantee. That's why they were destroyed. The only one with guarantee was Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and his children who were supposed to accept Tayag Mitzvahs. And the hope of the Bnei Shalom was that through Shimshon, he would be the Moshe Rabbeinu of that generation. And therefore the Zulosai would be redeemed, the total Zulosai. So he was the ultimate Mashiach ben done. So Yaakov Avinu was right. He was totally right when he thought Shimshon Hagibor. But he saw what would happen at the end. In the end, the Plishtim was able to do one thing, that through their death, they allowed the Goyim to exist till the end of time, but they could not become Jews. They failed. So their death has significance, but not in the way that God wanted it. So once the Jews saw this, and they realized that from now on, we are alone. We are the only ones that will be able to construct. They wanted a king, and they wanted the Beis HaMikdash to be permanent in their city of Jerusalem. So now the whole story makes tremendous sense. We see that it really refers to complete change of the status when the Goy became a permanent Zulosoi as a nation. And it would only be allowed for the Jews to become the people to build Olam Haba. Okay, so that's my share on that. It's a radical theory, and I have one thing that says that this story is true. Not only does it explain the whole chronology of the Shoftim at that time, that the Jews in and of themselves does not need a king. They don't need a government. They just have to be righteous with a Bezdin, the Sanhedrin. That's all they need. And they only became a sovereign nation with a king at the time when they lost the Zulosai. It was split into Jews and Goyim. That's when the Jews finally became the sovereign nation of the Jewish people. And then later on, the Jews kept on sinning, and they lost that sovereignty to do, but that's another share about the 10 tribes, the lost tribes. Because suddenly the Jewish people were fractions and segmented even further. Not only did the Jews themselves only become the nation which we constructed in Mabor, 10/12 of that nation had to go into exiles and never be found again. So in a certain way, they left the sovereignty of the Jews, and all that was left is Yehuda and parts of Binyamin and Levi. But that's another story, what happened then and so on and so forth. And how do I know that this story is really true? How? And I'll tell you one simple thing. There's another, we refer to Eretz Yisrael as Zion or Eretz Yisrael. The name of the land it's called the land of Israel. But Israel has another name. That's right. It has another name besides Eretz Yisrael. In fact, the Goyim called the land of Israel by a different name. What do they call it? The land of Israel has another name besides the land of Israel. Who knows what that name is? And that's the name that the Goyim gives to the land of Israel. Who knows what that name is?
Palestine.
That's my question. What?
Palestine.
Right. Okay. The other name for the land of Israel is Palestine. Where does the name Palestine come from? It comes from, they think it comes from Hadrian. When Hadrian was the Roman emperor, he named the country of Israel as Palestine. Why? Because he wanted to take away the sovereignty of the Jews. And he said, your country will no longer be called Israel, which identifies you as a sovereign nation, but I'm going to call them by the name of Palestine. So the name of Israel is called Palestine, Syria. That's the name. That was the name that was given to it by the Romans. But who else uses that name? The Goyim, the Arabs. The Arabs call the land of Israel Palestine. They do not refer to it as the land of Israel. Now, why should they call it Palestine? Why? Because the truth of the matter is, God is telling you, Why is he allowing a second name? Because he's saying to you, even though it is your land, and it technically is the land of Israel, but as far as I'm concerned, since the Mashiach is not here, you are not truly a sovereign nation, because you are in exile. And what does it mean? It means that the Jews, who are the people of God to build Olam Haba, and the land of Israel, where the land of Olam Haba will start, are separated. Most of the Jews, for most of the Jewish history, were not in the land of Israel. For 2,000 years, they were not in the land of Israel. So therefore, God was telling the Jews something else. That even though Israel is a holy nation, and it's a nation which has to do with mitzvahs, like Shemitah and Yovel, and many mitzvahs, and Tumah and Maasros, the land of Israel is the land which participates in mitzvahs. But I'm going to confiscate that participation, because I will exile you out of the land of Israel. You will from now on live for 2,000 years in the land of Babylonia, and then Europe, and then Russia, and so on, and then finally America. You will live in Golis. That will be your home. So therefore, the name of the land of Israel is not Israel, because it's not the home of a country that eventually will become the beginning of Olam Haba. It is simply a land, a geographical area. So God wanted to show the Jews that Palestine is simply a geographical location. It no longer has the Kedusha of Israel, because the land itself exiled you. So what name shall we give? What name was given to Israel instead of the name Israel? As a land, of a geographical location? Palestine. But where does the word Palestine come from? It comes from the Philistines. That's right. The word Palestine comes from the word Philistine, which was the name of the nation which Shimshon Hagibor was trying to make Jews. Don't you see the hashgach of this? Why did Hadrian choose the name Philistine? There were other countries that by the time of Hadrian controlled Israel. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, they all controlled the land of the Jews. So why didn't Hadrian name them as simply Assyria, or what do you call Babylonia? Why? Why did Hadrian name them the land of the Philistines? Because somehow Hadrian knew that really the last one, who was the last Goyish nation that had the right to become Jews and become part of the nation of Israel, were the Philistines, because that was the whole function of Shimshon Hagibor. But what happened? They lost. They lost the land of the Philistines. The Philistines became super Goyim, and Shimshon Hagibor failed. So therefore, the last one, the last Goyish nation who had possible access to the land of Israel with the opportunity to still become Jews were the Philistines. So he decided to name it Palestine after the Philistines. Why? Because the name Palestine refers to the land of Israel as a geographical location that should have been controlled by the Philistines and by the Goyim, by the Arabs. Why did the Arabs refer to the land of Israel as the land of Palestine? Because the land of Palestine is really the land of the Philistines. That's where the name comes from. Please make sure that please make sure that you're not interfering with my share through the sound. So what I'm saying is very deep, that the second name of the land of Israel for the Goyim, for the Arabs, and everyone else is Palestine. Since the Romans, Hadrian, they all refer to the land of Israel, not as Israel, but as Palestine. Why? Because it's still in the hands of Goyim. And the Jews no longer control the land of Israel. You may say, well, they're part of Israel now, but the Jews in Israel are not spiritual, really. Most of Israel is fly. Most of Israel is our teenage Nishba. The left is very strong. So as far as the left is concerned, the land of Israel is the land of Palestine. They agree with the Arabs and the Goyim that Israel is the land of the Philistines. So their name for Israel is Palestine, because they don't want Israel to be from religious They refuse to acknowledge that God wants Israel to be the land of the Mashiach. They are fighting a war against God now. Because God has a direct intent. When the Jews occupy the land of Israel again, and they come back, from that time on, I'm going to see to it that Israel becomes the land of the Mashiach. And now the left, or the secular Jews, don't want the land of the Mashiach. They're fighting God directly. God wants it to be the land of the Mashiach, and they say, we want it to be the left of secular Jews, of Zionist Jews. And that was the whole thought of Chaim Weizmann and Ben Gurion, to make Israel totally a secular land. And if you read the book Perfidy, in certain ways he participated with the Nazis to destroy them. But that's another story. So the name of Israel is Philistine, is Palestine, because it's really a geographical area called by the last Goyish nation who should have become Jews, but didn't. So therefore it remains the land of the Philistines. There's still the potential, when the Mashiach comes, that they finally again will become what? They will no more be Goyim, they will be Bnei Noach. But that's a deader story when the Mashiach comes. So therefore I see this as a lie, as a proof that the Philistines were people that Shimshon Hagibor was the Moshe Rabbeinu, was trying to make into Jews, literally Jews, who would keep Tayag mitzvahs. And the fact that he failed to make them Jews, that's why, and that the Jews were exiled from the land of Israel. So that's why the name of the land of Israel is the land of Palestine. It's named after who? After the Philistines, who were supposed to become the Jews and live in the land of Israel, not in the land of Palestine. So this to me is one proof that in God's eyes, the land of Israel is not a holy land where the Mashiach is going to be yet. Even the Jews in Israel, the Tinnish in Israel, the Erevav, is still fighting that the land of Israel should be the land of Palestine, that it's a secular nation, that it's a Goyish nation, who refuses to concede to God that it's the land of the Mashiach. So therefore, I've given a completely different interpretation of what this land is. So I thank you for appearing and to understand. And if you see in the Nach, the story of Shimshon Hagibor and the Philistines and the Jews at that time, you'll see that every facet, all of my 7 questions have been answered. Who Shimshon was, who the Philistines are, and why the Jews suddenly wanted a king and to build a Beis HaMikdash. It all flows. It all fits in. The story of Shimshon is the story of the creation of a permanent goy, that the Zulase will be permanently divided into those people who construct the land of Israel, construct Olam Haba through the observance of the Tayag mitzvahs, and the ones who cannot construct Israel. They are terrestrial. They simply can reside in the land of Israel, and the Jews are the gatekeepers. And this is a warning to every anti-Semite. All the anti-Semites are trying to destroy the Jews. And beware, you are destroying yourself. Because the Jews are the only gatekeepers. They are the gatekeepers to eternity. And they are the only ones who can construct Olam Haba. And by being an anti-Semite, by wanting the Jews to die, or to disappear, or to become Goyim, you yourself will be eventually annihilated. Okay, thank you for appearing to me. So please turn off the recorder. Well, I'll allow a question. Anyone have any questions about everything I said? I said a lot.
That's a very amazing idea.
What's that?
It's a very amazing idea. The Jews, I was thinking, only Jews can build Eretz Yisrael, and only Jews can build Olam Haba.
Right. That's what it is. What I've said is an amazing interpretation. It totally changes the story of what Shimshon Hagibor was trying to do and what resulted. It explains the entire Sefer Shoftim, what it has to do with the history of the Jewish people. Are there any more questions?
Shimon, I don't have a question, but I have a very big riot to you.
Oh, I'm open to hear any kind of proof.
Yeah.
What other riot?
The riot is that from Chal and Rus that explains the concept of Mashiach ben Don. He describes the conversation between the Yosef and the Don, where the Yosef tells the Don that I can't finish my job because my job is too hard.
Right.
I need you to do the next part. And when he describes it, normally you would think that he says it's too hard because I have to save the neshamas of the nedachim, the neshamas of the moisrim. But he doesn't say that. You know what he says?
What does he say?
His language is God wants me to save the neshamas of the geirim, and that I can't do. Because when I was Yerovim ben Avat, I tried it, he says, and I failed. And the only one that could save the geirim is you.
Yeah, but the Gerim, but you see, at the Gerim with the Goyim, God wanted to make the Goyim. The Goyim were not Gerim, because God wanted to make the Goyim into Jews. He wanted to do that in Egypt, because there was no Jew that was a Ben Tayyag. All the Jews were Ben Zion. They had to do the Noachide. There was no such thing as a Goy by the Egyptians, because when the Egyptians...
No, but he's not discussing
Jews,
it, Shimon. But you have to place it at the right time. He's not discussing Shimshon. He's discussing Sharia, which is the next Shimshon, at the end of time.
right.
And
Right.
Yosef tells him that God wants you to save the Goyim, and I can't do that. Understand?
Yes.
He doesn't say the Nedachim of Klal Yisrael. He says the Goyim. He calls them the
Yes,
Geirim.
because at that time they were already Goyim.
They were Geirim, and he describes a phenomenon where a whole bunch of Goyim want to become Jewish, and Yosef says, I can't deal with this. This is too hard for me to do. You have to do it, Shimshon. And
Right.
And he tells him,
Right.
you understand? So
Yeah, but that's
again,
not Sharia's Tachlis, no?
You see, because right there, what you say is the name.
Shaya
That's
is
the name
follow-up
of
of Shimshon, the last
Yeah.
in Mashiach ben Dan.
his name is Sharia. So that's the name of that's the name of the Mashiach ben David, who will come at the end of time to save even the Moisrim. So when Yaakov Avinu says
the
he selects
the
them,
Rachel says the Geirim. You see, I
know.
would want, yeah.
But what they have in common, what the Geirim have in common with the Moisrim, is that neither one of them are Zeichet Olam Haba. The Moisrim are not Zeichet Olam Haba, and they can't even live in Olam Haba. They have to be annihilated, but now God wants to save them through the Mashiach ben David. And also the Goyim can only reside in Olam Haba, and they have to be annihilated because they can't go to Olam Haba. So the Goyim and the Goyim and the Egyptians and the Goyim and the Gerim are both in the same Madrega. That a Goy cannot be a Ben Olam Haba, neither can a Moser. So that's why. But what happened was, by the Shimshon, who had a harder job, Shimshon or was it Moshe Rabbeinu? Who had a more difficult job? I can ask that question because they both had the same job. But which one had the harder job? Shimshon Hagibor? What? Shimshon had the harder job. Why? Because Shimshon had the harder job. Why? Because the Egyptians were all
in the parish of Zion. They were still B'nai.
Right, they were part of the Zion, and not only that, the Shimshon had
their status.
Okay, I heard what you said. Shimshon had the harder job. Excuse me. Shimshon, I agree with you. Shimshon had the harder job. Why? Because the Egyptians were, first of all, not Goyim at all, and not only that, they had Yosef Tzaddik to convince them, and they were convinced. It's only because the Jews worshipped idols that the Egyptians had Chavata, and they didn't become Jews. But it was easier to convert the Egyptians than the Philistines, because the Philistines were already Goyim. They were truly Goyim because they didn't accept the Tayyag mitzvahs, but they were only they were going, who still had the possibility to become Jewish. But the job would be much harder because having been goyim for all their life and all their history, and suddenly a man comes down called Shimshon, who Taka is the man of God, it's much harder to convert the true goy who has already been a goy for hundreds of years than to convert a people who are never goyim. The Egyptians were never goyim. From the outset, they would have the possibility to become Jews. So Shimshon, therefore, and that's why God had to make Shimshon spectacular. That he was so spectacular with his strength that he could convince them that I am the Moshe Rabbeinu of this generation. And I'm telling you, you're making a big mistake. You can still come back and become Jews. The opportunity to become Jews. It was also a harder job because the Philistines had a certain Yetzirah. They dominated the Jews. So they actually thought that since they dominated the Jews, they were stronger than God. Dagon, who was their God, was the Avodah Zarah, was stronger than the God. And the Egyptians also had that Yetzirah, but only later on when they enslaved the Jews. But in the beginning, they didn't enslave the Jews. They were machshir. They realized that the Jews were a very special, holy people. And that's why they agreed to become Jews. But they only agreed later on to enslave them when they saw that the Jews themselves would worship idols. So therefore we see that was much harder for Shimshon. Okay, thank you for your support and so on. But I believe what I've said is really the real shot of what the story of Shimshon is. And this story is completely concealed in Tanakh. God does not reveal anything about that story. What Shimshon was, the Mashiach ben David, the only way that we know what Shimshon was is because of the brach of Yaakov Avinu, that he was blessing the tribe of Dan with the thing. And that's the only way we know it. In fact, the interesting thing is who killed Esav? Esav was killed by a man that his name was Hushim. And Hushim was deaf. He was deaf and he couldn't speak. So Hushim had this. But who was Hushim? He was from the tribe of Dan. And he wound up killing Esav at the burial of Yaakov. Because Esav was making a complete, he was complaining, Esav, that he belongs in the Moshe Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, not Yaakov. And he was making such a commotion that when Hushim saw this from the tribe of Dan, he went over to Esav and beheaded him. And the head of Esav fell into the Morah, but Esav died. So the head of Esav is buried in the Morah of Machpelah. And there's a deep reason for that, which I'm not going to go into. But if you take the name Hushim, if you take the name of Hushim and you change the letters around, you know what comes out? The name Hushim, Ches Vav Shin Yud Mem. When you turn the letters around, the name, that's right, Hushim has the name Mashiach. So Hushim, in a certain sense, was the Mashiach ben Dan. And he was not able to talk, and he couldn't hear, because that was his Yisurim. But in a certain way, he was a servant of Chaloyim, because he couldn't speak and he couldn't hear. And not only that, the Mashiach ben Dan, we know, also has to suffer. So 1 minute. I want to say one more thing. Most people don't know what I'm about to say. Shimshon Hagibor was a superman. He was stronger than any human being that ever lived on the earth. But he was a Mashiach ben Dan. But doesn't it say that the Mashiach ben Dan is a servant of Elohim? Doesn't he also have to suffer for this? But Shimshon Hagibor was superhuman. So even though he was in charge of the possibility of making the Philistines into Jews, where do you see that he suffered? Well, what the Medrash says, that Shimshon Hagibor suffered, because even though he was so strong, he had major problems with 2 of his legs. That's right. Fundamentally, he had very big problems walking. I don't know what the problem is, but the Medrash seems to point to the fact that even though Shimshon was superhuman and could kill thousands of people with the jawbone of a mule, even though he can do that, he still had problems in walking. So therefore we see that Shimshon Hagibor in the problem of walking had this problem. Why? Why would Shimshon have a problem with his legs when he's a Superman? And the answer is because he's a Superman, because he's a Mashiach Madon. He is a Sovel Chaloyim. He has to suffer for the people that he wants to redeem. He simply doesn't redeem people who are almost gone, who are almost impossible to redeem, but he has to take on the suffering of them. And the Medrash says he suffered in his two legs, that he had problems walking. So this is a very deep thing about Shimshon Hagibor. He actually suffered for the Goyim. He suffered for the Philistines, so that he would have the ability to possibly make them into Jews. Okay, I believe this story is true. And why is this story hidden? Why is this story hidden? Because this is the greatest story since Yetzias Mitzrayim. The story of Shimshon Hagibor is the greatest story in the Kol HaTorah Kula. Why? Because it tells us the final Yerida of the Jerusalem. The greatest story in Klal Yisrael are two stories. Yetzias Mitzrayim, because when the Jews left Egypt, they became the nation of Jews of Tayag Mitzvahs. And the next greatest story is the story of Shimshon, who tried to save the Jerusalem as he was supposed to be. The Jerusalem was supposed to be Jewish. Shimshon was supposed to be successful in saving the people who had no chelik in Olam Haba, which are Goyim. He was trying to take advantage of the last opportunity to save the Goyim. He failed, and in the end he died. But even in his death, he did save Goyim, because he allowed them to have the schus to be Goyim until the end of history. But that's the second greatest story after Yetzias Mitzrayim. And why is that hidden? Because God did not hide Yetzias Mitzrayim, because that was the formation of the Jews. But on the second story of Shimshon, which was the last opportunity that God would again try to make Jews from Goyim, has to be hidden, because it failed, and the Ketrugim on this was so great, because it was a Yerida, it was a descent of the Jerusalem himself. It had international spiritual implications, that the failure of Shimshon to save the Philistines was the failure to keep the Goyim as Gerim, as to make them truly Jews again. It was the last time that the Goyim could become Jews and completely have a total nation of Jews all working on Olam Haba. We have a different Olam Haba now, because the Philistines refused to join us in the tachlis of becoming a Jew. The Philistines at the time of Shimshon refused to become gatekeepers. They should have been the gatekeepers of Olam Haba, just like the Jews, because they were supposed to be Jews. Had they listened to Shimshon Hagibor and not fought him, you see, totally. But the fact that they remained Goyim forever, as being only residents of Olam Haba, but never constructed of Olam Haba, was an einish to the Zulasai. It was the Yerid of Klal Yisrael. It's the Yerid of the Zulasai permanently. And that's why the story is completely hidden. Because God does not want Klal Yisrael to see the story in the open. Because it's a Ketrugim on the Goyim. That the Ketrugim was so great, the accusation against the Philistines was so great, God does not want that accusation known. Although the Jews did know it, and therefore responded by having a king in the Beis HaMikdash, it's not a story which is known openly. And that's why it's completely hidden. That's why everyone thinks that Shimshon was a Superman by himself, who had to avenge himself from the Philistines. They have no idea of the true purpose of Shimshon Hagibor in terms of the Zerusai itself, that he was the substitute for Yosef HaTzadik and for Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's the second greatest story. He was the story of the Mashiach Ben Don. He was finally the Mashiach who finally brings the Geula, because he is the Mashiach who pays the who finally comes, and his name is Shalia, Shin Resh Yud Hey. And that final Mashiach is the Geula Asida, where he brings the final Geula, where the Mashiach brings the total redemption. Okay, thank you for listening, and so on. Okay, I'm going to get off. Thank you for listening.
If Shimon, one Nakuda, maybe you could tie it in. Hazal describe Shimshon as a walking Beis Hamikdash the way it's meant to be. He says he was the makava for the Shechina. It rested between his shoulders, and his hair locks were like the bells of the Kohen Gadol. I don't.
Where did Hazal say this? Where did Hazal say this? It says that what?
The Shechina rested on his ksefov, on his ksafim, and his hair, the hair locks used to be like bells, and when he walked, it was like the Kohen Gadol walking in the Kodesh Kodeshim. He was a live Beis Hamikdash for some, and when he died, then Shlomo.
Well, you're right. Did Chazal say this in the Gemara?
I believe so. I have to look it up.
Look it up, please. And that supports my story. That Shimshon was the Mashiach ben Don. He was the greatest Mashiach next to Yosef HaTzadik and the greatest Mashiach next to Moshe Rabbeinu. He attempted to restore the Kedusha of this total Zulosai one more time before Philistines became the two Goyim and the forerunner of all the Goyim to the end of time. But thank you very much. I appreciate it if you look that up. Okay, thank you very much.
He tried to put the Beis Hamikdash back into the Zalasa, you're saying?
Yes.
Wow.
And if he had succeeded, he would have restored the Beis Hamikdash back to where it was supposed to be, in the mind of man, in the mind of the Jew. The Shekhinah was supposed to inhabit the mind of the person. It was not supposed to be on a building. And the fact that it was on a building or on a tabernacle is a yerida, it's a descent of the Zelasai. So Shimshon tried to restore, he tried to bring the Geula, because if the Philistines would have allowed themselves to become Jews, that would have been the Geula of the whole Zulasai. All of mankind would have participated in that Geula, which is the final Mashiach, because that's why the Mashiach Badon appears, to possibly bring the final Geula. Because by succeeding to make Philistines Jews, he would have brought the end of history. So consider this. Okay, thank you very much.